for why so few? I mean, when I was researching this, I expected there to be at least 20 people, not less than 10, right? Well, I believe that part of the reason is because it's just a lack of access to people back in that time, especially due to issues with race relations and lack of education resources for people of color during that time. But as we move forward in the time period that we look forward to broadening marine science and making all colors of the ocean come together.
Okay, so next we'll be going into our panelist discussion, and we'll be bringing our panelists onto this screen.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the first panelist we have is Miss Peyton Thomas. Just kidding, Jasmine Graham.
Hello, everyone. So I have a couple of.
I guess
oh, never mind. I can't share my screen.
Wait a second, Jasmine. We will have you share your screen in just a moment.
Okay.
Okay. Try now.
Yes, got it. Perfect. All right. So a little bit about my journey. So I'll start from when I was a kid. I was in a program called Alert, which was a gifted and talented program for kids interested in math and science. And then I did a magnet program called Learning Collaborative, or TLC, when I was in middle school, which is where I really got involved in science specifically. And then whenever I went to high school, I actually came to UNCW to do the Marine Quest program. And that was when I discovered that marine science was a thing that you could do as a job. I had always loved the ocean and spent a lot of time fishing with my dad and my grandmother. My dad's from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And so we spent a lot of time doing fishing and being near the water. And so I got the chance to further explore the science behind why certain fish were in certain places. And I found that really interesting. And so I decided that I wanted to go to college for marine biology. And so I ended up going to the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina. While I was at the College of Charleston, I tried a bunch of different marine science things. I volunteered with the Marine Mammal Stranding Network in their necropsy lab, trying to figure out why certain animals had stranded and died. I also did a research experience for undergraduates where I was working with sharks, hammerhead sharks, looking at their evolutionary history. And that's kind of where I first got interested in sharks, which you'll see I stuck to. But I also did an internship at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, where I worked on a coastal acidification project. I did a couple of other things, including some marine chemistry things, some research with microplastics, but ultimately I decided that sharks was the thing for me. And so I ended up joining the American Elasmobranch Society and applying to the Graduate Research Fellowship Program with a proposal to study the small-toothed sawfish, which is a critically endangered ray species. And I took that grant to Florida State University to do that research. And now I currently am at Mote Marine Laboratory in Sarasota, Florida. I continue my research in collaboration with Havenworth Coastal Conservation, looking at the movements of sharks and rays. And then at Mote, I am the coordinator for a program called Marseillais, which is focused on broadening participation of underrepresented minority students in marine science. And I have some fun photos of all of the different types of things that I've done in the past. So this kind of shows you the diversity of things that you can do with marine science. I did digital segmentation, which is basically like dissecting, but on the computer. So I did a lot of computer work. I did some lab things where I was looking at DNA and I got to learn how to extract DNA. I got to CT scan sharks, which is how I got the data to do those digital dissections. I got to work a lot with museum collections, preserve specimens of sharks. I also got to spend time in the fields collecting samples from wild populations and doing catch and release studies. I did, like I said, some marine chemistry things where I got to kind of flex my engineering muscles a little bit and build a system to measure water quality on the go. And I did a lot of sampling and some of the less glamorous things in marine science, which includes scraping organisms off of your equipment when it stops working. And I did some chemistry things, did some things with identifying different types of plankton in the Chesapeake Bay. I got to do, like I said, work with hammerhead sharks, both museum specimens and live sharks in the wild. And like I said, I got to do a lot of CT scanning and learning this cool technique and making, this is what the scans look like when I'm done with the digital segmentation. So I got to learn all of this software and have some really cool experiences with that. And then, of course, I am super fortunate that I get to work with the small-toothed sawfish, which, as I mentioned, is critically endangered. So they're incredibly rare. Most people go their entire lives without seeing one, and I get to work with them, and that's super exciting to me. And then, of course, I get to focus on my passion for making marine science more accessible. As was mentioned, for a long time, science and marine science was not accessible to people of color. And so I spend a good bit of my time making sure that the path to marine science is easier for those that come behind me through the Marseille program, as well as the Minorities in Shark Sciences group that I co-founded and currently run. We have over 250 members, all women of color from around the world, 18 different countries. And so this just goes to show you that the interest is there for women of color in marine science. We just need access and opportunity. And that's all I got.
Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. Next up, we have
Miss Peyton. It is your turn.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Peyton. I didn't bring a presentation, but I'll just talk about myself. So I'm currently a PhD student here at UNC Wilmington in Dr. Steve Kinsey's lab. I didn't always want to be a marine biologist, actually. I grew up kind of landlocked in Atlanta, Georgia. But always had a fascination with the environment, always wanting to be outside and playing in the water, lived near a river. But my family definitely didn't come from a background where we were heavy in fisheries or really being outdoors. So I was sort of like this outcast kind of in my family, just like always wanting to be outside, always wanting to play with animals and like learn more about the world around me. And so I went into my, well, I guess growing up, also was in some like gifted and talented programs, but that was actually really difficult for me in the beginning. So I don't know if many people know about like the schooling system in Georgia, but you can see sort of how disparities become really real. And I guess I would kind of be one example of that. I didn't grow up like in the inner city in Atlanta, but was in a northern suburb, and there were constant roadblocks to getting into some sort of gifted and talented program. And there were many times where like many of my peers would get into that program. I had to get tested like 3 different times in like kindergarten to you're considered a gifted and talented kid when you're like 5 years old. And my parents were very steadfast in making sure that I had an opportunity to be able to excel with other people in this gifted program. And so with that extra testing, was able to get that. But for a lot of people, they don't get many chances to do that. And that leads to this huge gap basically in your level of education that you get from a really young age. And that didn't really become clear to me actually until like a few years ago. It's just like having this realization, and you see that like throughout the schooling system in those early years. But yeah, so throughout middle school and high school was always involved in different environmental clubs, trying to get into those more rigorous classes, and just wanted to learn more about the natural world. And once I got into undergrad is when I really sort of narrowed my focus into aquatic sciences, and when I got my first research opportunities. And so that was really exciting for me. And I was in an environmental science program at Baylor University, and it was a really great program, but I was definitely the only person of color in my program. And so that was a bit well, I guess not really different, but I definitely expected more people who looked like me to be in that space. But it didn't really dampen the experience for me. I think I still got a really great education and enough experience to want to broaden my horizons in terms of my research interests. So in undergrad, I did a lot of different things, but really honed in on the ecology of fishes and how that relates to, well, specifically like their feeding habits. And so I worked both on freshwater systems, because where sorry, my computer's shaking, because where I went to school was along a river, but I was in Texas. And so we did a lot of coastal research as well. So I worked on both freshwater fishes and coastal fishes. And once I got to the coast there, it was like the most amount of time that I'd ever spent in any sort of coastal setting. And it was really invigorating. And I really just wanted to learn more about marine science from there, because my university not being on the coast, that was a bit difficult to get more of that in-depth learning experience beyond just going out and collecting fish and being there for a couple of days at a time. And so most of my undergraduate research was on microplastic ingestion in these freshwater fishes and coastal fishes, and basically comparing rates of ingestion and seeing how it relates to the way that they live in their environment. So we looked at species that are very similar in their feeding habits, comparing freshwater and marine species. And yeah, that really sparked my love for just wanting to work with fish more. I don't really know what to say beyond that. I just like love fish and wanted to learn more about how diverse they are and just how they live their lives. And so that led me to do a couple of internship experiences in undergrad as well. One was focused on environmental chemistry, and it was really airborne focused. So it was kind of a divergent experience, but it still sort of gave me this extra knowledge about things going on around me that aren't necessarily like aquatic based. And then my other research experience that really shaped kind of what I want to do moving forward was this internship out in Oregon, literally in the middle of nowhere, but it was one of the best research internship experiences that I've ever had. And it was basically just going out and doing juvenile salmon surveys, and also surveys for this threatened minnowfish species. And you're just snorkeling all day long and recording data and getting to learn more about how these fish live in this environment, and also engaging the people around you with like how to better protect these organisms, because everyone loves salmon up in the West Coast, but the people that live there may not necessarily know what is best to be able to protect them. And so that was a really invigorating experience for me and made me want to pursue grad school and do marine research in grad school. So that's what led me to UNC Wilmington. And so I'm now here doing fish physiology work and mostly doing work in a lab right now, but I do get some chances to go out in the field and observe fishes in their natural environment. And I look at basically their stress systems, how stressed they are under extreme environmental conditions. So right now I'm mostly focusing on elevated temperatures and hypoxia stress, and basically just seeing how fishes adapt to these stressors, especially when we are considering a lot of effects of climate change on a variety of different species. And so that's what I do, and it's a variety of microscopy and immunoblotting, which is like Western blotting or dot blotting, if anyone knows what that is, but basically looking at these markers of oxidative stress in these organisms. And it's really fun, and I enjoy what I do now, and just happy to be here.
Great job. Thank you so much for that introduction about yourself, Peyton. Next up, we have Ryan Bithia.
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan. I'll just keep it nice and short for you. Just like the other panelists before, I'm 36, so I'm probably one of the most senior people here in terms of age. But the same thing happened with me with testing constantly testing, 96, 99 percentile on end-of-grade tests, and then we actually had advocacy from my parents. That's kind of how they continue to keep me in AG programs. I think that's the same with everybody on the panel. But I think for the people listening, it's important to know it's all of our experiences. That's not like an extreme, or that's not, in this area or that area. I grew up in Durham, and so one of my AAG teachers actually told my parents that I don't think like an academically gifted kid. Whatever that means. So obviously the only minority in AG, grew up loving the water. I was a part of Hollow Rock. It was like a country club, or like a swim club and tennis club in Chapel Hill for the people that are Triangle. The only minority, of course, there at all. And then it's also important to note, before I talk about kind of what I do in the industry, it's important to note when I was teaching in Franklin County in like 2017, so we're talking 3-4 years ago, the only pool in the county is white only. And you're probably wondering, well, it's 2021, how, there's laws against that kind of stuff. All you have to do is just not admit Black members. It's pretty easy. You just don't say that's because they're Black. Just don't admit it. And so this is real. This is something that happens all the time. And again, the panelists and other people that are minorities, know this, but I think a lot of folks that aren't minorities think maybe we're talking about extremes, or we're talking about something 50 years ago. This is something that happens today. Being able to swim is a barrier to be in marine sciences. So, recognize that. So I'm Ryan Bethea, Oysters Carolina. We're a oyster farm at Harker's Island, North Carolina. We're on the north side of the island in a place called Westmouth Bay. We're a small to medium farm, so we grow anywhere from 150 to 300,000 oysters. Something that's unique about us is we're the only oyster farm in the country that harvests the oysters the same day that we deliver them. So we deliver anywhere in North Carolina for free. And that morning we'll harvest the oysters. We'll take a picture and a video with the timestamp. We'll text it to you so you know they came out of the water that morning. And then we drive it to you anywhere in North Carolina for free. There's no minimum, because we want everybody to have access to our seafood. Most of the seafood in North Carolina gets either shipped down to the Gulf, or gets shipped up to New England, or gets exported. We want North Carolinians to have access to this great fishery that we have here. And if we either raise our price, or if we put a minimum on this, it's going to keep people that are maybe in a lower social economic status, or have a lower social economic status, not have access to this protein, which is the healthiest animal protein that you can find, and also the most sustainable. And so that's my job. That's what I do. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for that information. Really, really appreciate it. And then last but not least, it's going to be Charlton.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Charlton. So I am currently in New York City. I'm in Brooklyn. But I will just give a brief story about just like growing up. I moved around a lot. My dad worked for a company called DuPont, and what that meant is every time you got a different position, we were in a new city. So I was always a new kid all the time. But what was interesting about that is I was always in a school where they were great schools, but I was always one of the few Black kids for the most part in all my classes and things like that. And I, went through school and didn't really think a lot about it until I started getting older and reflecting on it. But as far as my interest in marine science, my mom took me to the movies to go see The Little Mermaid. It was just Disney and it was great. And I was like, oh, this is like the ocean's so cool. And I actually lived in Wilmington, North Carolina at one point. So we were near the beach and things like that. And and my dad is in science and my mom is a teacher. So they both put me in Marine Quest when I was in 9th grade, I believe. But before that, I also started scuba diving. Like I got certified with scuba diving when I was like in 4th grade. And it was just, I was ready to go and it was great. And so I did Marine Quest, and then that led me to go to UNC Wilmington for my undergrad in marine science. And I specialized mostly with sea turtles. So I did the internship at the Gene Beasley Sea Turtle Hospital in Topsail, North Carolina. And so we worked with rehabilitation of sea turtles and getting them back into the ocean and doing nesting counts and nesting protection. And then when I was finished with that, I went to Long Island to go to Stony Brook to get my master's in marine conservation and policy. And so what I did mostly there for my research was two things. I still worked with turtles, and I did nest counting and nest protection. And I also worked in the city with the Wildlife Conservation Society doing electrofishing and doing electric eel counts in the Bronx River. And so that kind of led me into living in New York City. And when I first got to New York, what I did was I worked with a nonprofit that essentially worked with mostly Black and brown kids to get them invested in science. So we worked with them in the winter, and then we took them to a sustainable farm in the Berkshires to actually apply that science outdoors and get that access and learning, not just marine science, but just the environment, ecology, and all of that. And it was really great to see them have this access to it. I mean, I don't know if anyone has been to New York, but city kids are a whole different breed, a whole different monster. And so taking them out in the wild, it was very jarring for them, but they learned a lot. And I think we talk about access points, and for a lot of those students, that was an access point. And so what led me to what I'm currently doing is I was working in a school, and a teacher was saying that, you really work well with students, and I really think you should consider doing a teaching fellows program, which is a 2-year master program. So I decided to do it, and I ended up getting what is my current job in Brooklyn. And I found a school that was looking to start a marine science class. And I had the background and the experience. And so I started working there, and I work with a specific transfer school, which is for students who are in and out of the system and they're overage and they're what the New York considers high risk, high need students. And unfortunately, that tends to fall into the category of minorities. And, New York City is this huge city filled with all different types of people, but the school system is one of the most segregated there is. And so I work with these students who are generally 18, 19, 20, and get them there, and I do my marine science class and get them to get enough credits to get their diploma before they age out of the system. And I do a lot of work in terms of equity, and right now I'm working with a program that's really trying to take into account how our minority students are feeling in their schools and in their environments, and really hearing their voice. And when I think about my experiences as a kid, I loved science, and I loved just all that it had to offer. But I noticed a lot of the time I was the only one, and that was very isolating. And I can only imagine, it's still isolating as an adult, but I can imagine as young kids and teenagers and coming of age, it is isolating, and you want to be seen, and we all are not a monolith, and we all have different interests. And for me, doing marine science and getting them to realize like we're right by the Atlantic Ocean and all these animals, and also getting them to develop behaviors that will help the environment, like teaching them, where does your plastic go? Where do the chemicals go after you wash your face? What does it do to the animals? And just helping them see themselves. And my students will joke with me that, you know, this is white people stuff. But I try to tell them, like, why do you think that way, right? Why can't it can be anybody, right? And I think for a lot of them, it is a great access point. And I like to think of myself as someone who creates that access point for these students to get them prepared to love science. And I've really been happy to see a lot of my students decide that they like marine science and want to continue it. And I've actually suggested the program that I did, which was Marine Quest, to just get them out there. And I know Ryan mentioned something about swimming, and that's actually a big thing with my students. I tell them, like, you need to experience the beach. And they're like, well, I can't swim, right? And it's like, well, why, right? Why are there all these barriers and just lack of access? And so I hope that in the post Black Lives Matter world, that we're at least starting the conversation, because I think personally, I feel like if you want to start somewhere, listen to us and hear what we have to say and our obstacles. And I think there's so much to learn. And yeah, and so I feel like I am hopefully making a difference, and I'm excited to still also be doing marine science because it's something I'm very passionate about, as well as teaching.
Thank you guys so much. We super appreciate all of our panelists. If you guys can, give them a quick round of applause. If you guys can, go ahead and give our panelists a quick round of applause. Thank you guys so much. Now, audience, we are about to have all of our panelists come up on the screen. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And if you don't have any questions, that's okay. We have some starter questions as well. All right, so the first question that we have for our panelists, and audience, remember, if you guys have a question, put it in the chat, and then we will call your name and ask you to unmute yourself so that you can ask your question. And this goes to any of our panelists. How cost effective is this job? And you guys can unmute yourselves and talk if you want. Any takers?
Well, can you clarify cost effective? Like, what do you mean in that context?
There's lots of costs that have to go with like buying equipment, or like having to go out and buy scuba gear for your mask so you can go and get scuba certified. How would you say, like, would you say it's attainable for an average student to be able to afford being a marine biologist?
I definitely think so. I feel like there's more, I think when I think of like a program, the programs that I've done, I think a lot of programs are starting to be more aware of people's socioeconomic situation. And I just only speak for my job right now. I feel like it works, and I think it's attainable. I think it starts, for me, I feel like it starts in the classroom for my job, and I feel like there's access to lab equipment and things that can get them started. But I also think that programs are just becoming more aware of the fact that everyone's situation is different. So I think it just, I guess, depends. But for me as a teacher, I feel like it's doable to get students opportunities.
Awesome, thank you. Does anybody else want to add to that, or would you like to move on to the next question?
I'll add to that. So one of the reasons why we started MISS is because, at least in shark science, that's a huge financial barrier. because shark science is really weird. It was definitely designed by white men for white men. And so they have this weird concept where you either work for free or you pay the person to work on their boat, which is absurd. And so we started Miss because we were like, this is messed up. You can't charge people to work for you. That's crazy. And so we actually started Miss and started having workshops and offering fellowships to cover the cost of people's travel to get to the places and their expenses for being on the boat. So it is definitely a huge barrier, the financial barrier for shark science. And I tell people all the time that I'm here because someone listened to me when I said I can't afford to do this, and they literally moved mountains to get me into shark science. And so I'm returning the favor and moving mountains for other people. And so for shark science, it's definitely a big barrier that is starting to be worked on. We've called out enough people that they're saying, oh, I guess we should throw in some scholarships or something so we don't get called out. But yeah, it is definitely prohibitively expensive, but it is definitely getting better. There are more and more places offering scholarships and covering travel expenses and housing and things like that. So it is getting better, but when I was coming up, it definitely was prohibitively expensive.
Perfect. Okay. You just got a question from an audience asking, how are you funding Miss?
So we fund Miss mostly through philanthropy. So we are a grassroots movement. So we actually started out just on social media asking people, if you think that this shouldn't be a barrier that exists to do science, can you give $5? And so our average donation size is $20. So we raised $40,000 with the average donation size being $20. So it goes to show you that a little bit goes a long way. If you convince a lot of people to give a little bit of money, you eventually piece it together. We also write some grants. And so we're now funded by a couple of institutions that gave us grant funding. But yeah, it's largely grassroots. And we depend on the generosity of other people for the most part. And yeah, that's pretty much where we get our funding from, is we raise it ourselves because we don't want the students to have to do that. I would rather take the onus off of them, and I do that, and I take that burden, than have students have to come up with the money themselves.
Oh, that's so sweet. I love that. Okay, next question is, how can I be proactive in this field? Would you guys like some more clarification on the question? So what are some ways that I can make sure that I get stuff done before I either start college or start my career? What are some things that can put me ahead of the competition?
I told this when I was teaching, and I talk about this all the time on Zoom calls, is just to get involved. Show up, be there. People, you're going to stick out. If you're on this call right now and you're in the marine biology or marine sciences, you're going to stick out. So just show up, help, and it seems to, that'd be a good way, in my opinion.
I would say networking is just always a thing. It right. Really is who you know sometimes. And yep. I know Dr. Kezios. I mean, she's known me since I was a baby. And, so there's access points, but I also feel like what's something I wish I told my younger self is building relationships with your teachers or any adults that you feel connected to. I think something I've learned as a teacher is thinking about the fact that I can look at other teachers that I've been around and like, wow, yeah, they were the reason why I felt this way or felt another way. And I think building those relationships does help you stand out, because I think especially when you're young, there's this like fear of adults, and you're like, I don't want to talk to my teacher. Like, I don't want to do that. Right. And I get it. Right. I mean, I like to think I'm a cool teacher, but they, you know, think I'm 80 years old, you know, and I'm not cool, but still I'm like, connect and really build those relationships, and don't try to be so too cool for school that you'll miss out on networking and things like that. And I think a lot of the times when you just really pay attention in class and build relationships with professors, you know, it starts with that. And as far as grad school goes as well, you know, building relationships with professors kind of does give you that next step into grad school if you want to. So I think networking is important. And I think, you know, using your voice. And I think when we're talking about equity and things like that, I think using your voice is powerful. But that doesn't mean you have to be alone. So I think just building that network of people that really help you and push you. And that may not be your parents or whoever, but if there's somebody that can be there, I think that's always like a good start if you're trying to, you know, continue moving forward.
All right, thank you so much. Our next question is, how do you deal with the slow progress dealing with equity? Of marine biology.
I would just say it's really tough. Like, there's no really like great answer to that question. At least for me, it's just like, you just got to keep moving forward and pushing. I feel like that same question could be asked for like all of society, like slow progress just in general. Yeah.
It's been hard. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with what Peyton said, is that I don't know, I just try to look at what has been done and say, okay, at least we got somewhere. And then I think the one other way that I deal with it is that I let myself be upset about it. Because the tendency is to be like, oh, the strong Black woman, and you're not supposed to let things bother you. But if someone says something racist to you, you're allowed to feel some type of way about that. And so I just, you know, my mom always said, cry about it, get mad, and then go do what you got to do. And so that's kind of how I tackle it, is if someone says something to me or I face some sort of discrimination, I go off, I'm mad about it, I'm sad about it, I cry it out, I do whatever, and then I'd say, well, I'll show you, and go do what I'm going to do anyways. So, yeah.
It's definitely frustrating, and I think, you know, something that's always been told to me is, you know, I do therapy and things like that and talk about these issues. And, you know, one of the mantras is using your voice. And I feel like a lot of people don't realize, being a minority in a predominantly white field or in an environment, is hard to use your voice, because that means you sometimes have to stand alone. And I think, you know, there's so many levels to all of this. And I think, you know, when I think of like Black Lives Matter, you know, you had to carry that into, you know, that's not something I just put away, go to work, put it back, you know, it's always encompassing. And I think for a lot of people, you know, there's not every person is necessarily throwing around slurs and things at you, but there's always these like subtle things that happen. And I think anytime you're mixing races or you're mixing genders or anything that is different, you're bound to say or do something, right? And I think it's a matter of really listening and understanding, but also allowing minorities to be multifaceted. And I think there, again, Jasmine, you mentioned like being the strong person all the time. And that's not realistic. I feel like it's not realistic for me as a person to always be strong, and that vulnerability actually helps you be stronger. And I think so with frustrations, it's allowing yourself to feel it, and hopefully people are listening and really hearing you, and then thinking about how you want to move forward, because you also don't want it to hold you back where you become a shell of your person. And I think it's an interesting point to think of how many parts of yourselves do minorities kill to fit in, to survive in these environments. And I think of through many years, I've killed parts of myself to fit in. And now as an adult, I'm like trying to find those pieces again and stay strong in those pieces, but you know, just allow myself to be multifaceted. And I think there's a freedom with that.
This is Morgan O'Connell. I'm behind the computer, but the ladies aren't able to see this clearly. So I was going to ask this question for them. We have several folks who have asked questions saying they want to increase diversity within their organization, but they might not have visual representation to do that right. Any suggestions on how they can take steps to be more diverse and inclusive?
Are these predominantly white organizations that want to know this?
Say the majority of them that have come through are. Some, I'm not sure the entire depth of their organization.
So I couldn't hear part of the question, but are you asking about predominantly white organizations that don't have diversity in their staff, how they can improve diversity? Is that the question?
Yes, that is the question. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, at the risk of sounding obvious, you could go hire people of color. that would be a start. And yeah, I don't know what else to say to that. You have to look at your biases that you have. There's a reason why your staff is all white, not to like attack people, but that seems like an issue with the way that you are recruiting people or the way that you are doing your application process. So I would maybe look at, okay, of the applicants that we're getting in, how many are minorities? And if you don't have any minorities applying, then it's a recruitment issue. If you have minorities applying and you're not picking them, there's probably a bias in your process. So that would be my suggestion.
The question specifically was about how to go about recruiting more diverse.
Oh, okay. I missed that part.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say that you have to meet people where they're at. I think that a lot of times people are kind of just throwing applications or job opportunities out into the void. But people that are marginalized often don't have the networks or the access to those resources if you just throw them out into the void. So going to minority serving institutions and recruiting, or going into the communities that you're trying to serve. So if your organization serves the Wilmington area, then go into the communities that aren't necessarily going to seek out those opportunities. So going into, I think you have to get more creative, because the way that society is structured, there's people that have access to certain places and people that don't. So going to community centers, going to the Urban League, or, you know, somewhere that, because we say that communities are underserved, but they are being served by someone. Usually that's like, you know, a community center, a church or something, and getting in contact with them would be a good start. It's a lot more effort on your part. And basically you're switching the onus over from the person seeking the job to the person trying to hire people. So yeah, I'm just gonna tell you, it's gonna be a lot of work, but it's worth it.
I think places need to be purposeful with what they're doing, because folks are being purposefully left out. And so to include them, you're going to have to be purposeful to get them in.
Our next question is for Ryan, and it is dealing with your oysters. Have you seen effects on climate change dealing with them? And if so, how can we help?
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff that we deal with in terms of climate change with oysters. The number one thing in North Carolina is going to be sea level rise and ocean warming. They kind of go hand in hand. Nationally or internationally, a big issue is ocean acidification. So carbon dioxide, most of it, people think it goes up into the atmosphere. Most of it actually it's heavier than air, so it sinks back down. It gets in our ocean. It changes the pH level. And then anything that has an exoskeleton or anything that uses calcium carbonate as a home is affected by that. So crabs, shrimp, all those shellfish, any kind of bivalve. Okay, so ocean acidification is an issue that we're seeing from climate change around the globe. In terms of us specifically, when you have the temperature rising, right, then you have warmer oceans. And when you have warmer oceans, two things happen. You're going to have less dissolved oxygen. Okay, so that's not going to be good. You're also going to have warmer waters for these storm systems. So the storm systems are going to be wetter, which means more rainfall. And so you're going to have a lot more fresh water inundation. And then the second thing is these storms are going to be more powerful, and we're going to see them more often. And when you have that, you have damage from infrastructure, right? So oyster cages, boats, docks, that kind of damage. And then you also have closures as well, where the state does a really good job mandating, that the water is safe, but after a certain number of rainfall occurs, then they shut down the oysters or shut down the ability to harvest the oysters. So then guys can't harvest oysters and can't make money. So, those are just all kinds of things that happen. I mean, we could talk about how the storms get wet in inland, and then it all floods and comes down to our coast, and then oysters can't survive under 10 parts per thousand salt, and so it kills them that way. It's anybody that works in the environment, whether it's marine biology or forestry, they're dealing with climate change right now and some of those issues.
Thank you. Gotcha. Okay, so next question is for Charlton, and we wanted to ask, how have the impacts of equity dealing with COVID changed, and are there any suggestions to help alleviate those issues?
So it's been pretty tough. The school that I work at is we have the students that get left behind. That's really what the students I work with. And it's been difficult because not only are they super impacted by COVID just on a personal basis, the brief switch to remote has been jarring. A lot of students don't have computers at home that they can use, or they're home and they have 6 brothers and sisters running around and they can't focus, or they have to go to work. So that's really, really changed. But I will say that this has always been the case with my students. And I mean, the most obvious thing is that the mayor needs to do better, obviously the government. But I think that's an important point to talk about with my students, is that your vote, they're old enough to vote. So getting them to really understand that situation in that sense. But in terms of strategies, teaching marine science is very difficult online because I'm used to having labs and things like that. And a lot of my students, some of them can't really read, or they can't do, there's so many barriers. And I saw the question, it said teaching strategies. So with my students, I do have some that are really high skilled and some that aren't. So in terms of things that I've been able to provide for them, I've really had to do things like film my own labs and really talk about it and things like that. But I I will be honest and just say it's all very confused. Like we're all unsure where to really go. But I think if anything, it's highlighted the fact that a lot of students need these systems to survive, whether that's school or just a place to go. And they've been impacted. And I think the only solutions that I can really give at the moment is speaking about it, being active about it, making sure that we provide them with the resources that they need. So really making sure they have computers, that they're able to get what they need to get done. But I think right now it's just, I think a lot of teachers are just at a loss, if I'm being honest. And my strategy is I work with my students one-on-one. I work at a small school. I only have 184 students compared to schools with thousands of students. So it makes it a little bit easier. But I think it's just something to think about. And I think when we have these conversations and we talk about equity, we have to remember the history of this country and the fact that it was not built for us to do well. It wasn't built for us to succeed, and those barriers are still present. And even though we're not segregated, they're still present. And I think not only the education part, but the personal part. Right now, you have to think about the mental health of our Black students and our Black kids, because not only is this hard with COVID, but we're talking Black Lives Matter. And as an adult, this has been a big issue for me thinking about my identity, but it's going to be for them as well. And so I think it's just a mixed bag of things. I know that might not be a direct answer, but it's the truth. And I think that's what we need to start with, to hear that we don't know. Like all the systems that we thought were here for us are not working for us. And that's the system problem. But it starts with really getting my voice out there, doing something like this. Working in policy, conservation and policy makes you realize too the lawmaking process of things, and it's just a lot. But I am trying my best to teach my students skills that will help them. Our school is, I'll keep it brief, but our school is a skill-based school, so we don't give A, B, C, D, and F. We teach them on skills. So how well do you communicate? How well do you have scientific literacy? How well, and I actually think more and more they're starting to show that those skill-based school systems are actually better for our students and preparing them for jobs. Like, yes, I want you to talk to me about coral reefs, but I'm really looking to see how well you read a long document and are able to tell me what it's about and answer questions that are specific, because that's what it's job preparedness. So I'll just end it with saying that I think schools should really look into this standard skill-based learning besides the A, B, C, D, and F, because I think the skills are really what's going to take students and prepare them for this world. So if you have any more questions about that, feel free to reach out. It's actually, I really love the system. So yeah.
Thank you. Going into our next question, in you guys' opinion, how can non-people of color be an ally?
Do you guys need more clarification?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, goodness.
I can go. So I will be honest, I'm going to all white schools. I've had a lot of white friends. I've dated people outside of my race and things like that. And I will say that the first thing is listening, truly, and understanding that the world is set up for you. And this isn't, something to attack you for, but the world is set up for white people to be seen and heard in all facets of their life. And I think remembering that, like, for a lot of minorities, there hasn't been a lot of space to speak and be really heard. And also understand, I think there's been a lot of conversation about racism, and to get people to understand that it's not just calling someone a slur. It's more than that. Sometimes it's, why don't I have any Black friend? You know, is your group all white? Or when someone points out something, what is your response? Do you get angry at being called racist? Or do you get angry that your Black friend feels that way? Like, you know, knowing that slight difference is hard, and it's hard. It's not going to be easy, but I think understanding that there's so many levels of it, and also that your Black friends are not an accessory or a monolith, and that we're all different and have different interests and things like that. But I think if anything, first look at your circle, see if your circle's diverse, and then if it's not, maybe start there. But then if you do have people of color in your life, and Black people specifically, really think about how you are with them, right? Like, are you listening to them? Are you giving them the space? Are you, you know, believing them? Are you gaslighting them? Are you, you know, there's so much of that. And I think with the political climate right now, there's a lot of people believe that I would never do the extreme racism that you see on TV. But as a Black person, I don't deal with someone calling me the N-word every day of my life. I deal with those little things all the time. And that really nitpicks at you over time, and that it's a lot. So just keeping that in mind. There's more I could say, but I'll be on here for 3 hours, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I second everything that Charlton just said. And I think that sometimes when people think about being an ally, they think it has to look like really extreme, but you can also be an ally in really small ways. If it's super daunting for you, you could start small with just simple things like amplifying other people. So if you sit in a room and there are people talking and a Black person says something and is ignored, that's an opportunity for you to act as an ally and say something like, oh, I really like what such and such had to say. Can you repeat that? I mean, that's a very little thing that makes a big difference, and it makes sure that somebody's heard. Whenever you see things happening or someone says something, it doesn't always have to look like you going on a diatribe about why they shouldn't say that. Sometimes you just have to indicate that what they said is not okay. So I have a friend, and she literally just says, gross. That's all she says. If someone says something that is racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever, all she says is gross. That's it. That just indicates that I feel like what you just said was not okay. And sometimes that's all people need. If people don't have anyone push back against them and they think it's okay to say something, they're just going to keep saying worse and worse things, because that's like people's natural tendency. It's like, okay, I was able to say that joke and no one got upset, so let me say an even worse joke. And so sometimes you just got to cut it head off. So it doesn't always have to be standing at the front of a protest taking rubber bullets. It also can just be, hey, this person said something, and I think we should go back to that because I like what they said. Can you expand on that? And I also think that it's really important for allies to remember that they are not the people that are going to get the repercussions for their actions. So sometimes on the other side of that, people do and say things on behalf of Black people and people of color that actually cause more issues for Black people and people of color. So it's always a good idea to just check in with how someone wants to be advocated for, because if you stand up in a meeting and say like, well, that the boss said blah, blah, blah to this person, you are not going to get the repercussions from that. The Black person is. That's just how it goes. So, and if you get angry, it's going to be blamed on the Black person. So you just want to make sure that you are checking in and that you're advocating for people in the way that they feel comfortable with you advocating for them. And those are my recommendations.
Thank you. That was amazing. Okay. And our last question that we have for today is, have you seen any changes that inspire you, and do you think we are moving forward in the right direction?
I mean, I can just say this on behalf of being on the UNCW's Biomarine Bio SAND committee. That came about because over the summer, a lot of us in the department really wanted to see change happen. We've realized that the Biomarine Bio department is very homogeneous, and like that there definitely needs to be some changes because it's been going on for a really long time. But like learning more about the department's history, because I've only been here for a few years, but like learning about what it's like now and where they've come from, even without having this committee, and like learning more about how we can move forward. The diversity committee has already done a lot to move our department forward. So they've already implemented making changes to the hiring practices, which is amazing. And they implemented that during this semester's current hiring process. And that's been really awesome. And we've already facilitated a town hall within our department to see where our entire department, even including graduate students, are feeling. Because in a lot of these situations, I don't know if it's only a UNCW thing or if this happens across a lot of universities, but a lot of times like graduate students in general don't really get much attention. And so if you're a minority student in a graduate student program, it kind of just feels like you're alone, or just like no one really understands anything that is going on amid all the other issues with graduate students in terms of getting resources and everything. So in terms of the Biomarine Bio department here, I'm really excited to be a part of the committee and like help us create even more change than we've already started. So that's pretty exciting here.
I definitely think there's been some shifts. I think one thing I'll say about teaching that always makes me happy is they are learning differently. And it always reminds me that even if we're not seeing things on a major scale at the moment, there are just different ways of thinking. And I feel like in the past year, I've had conversations, like even just some of the stuff I've said on this Zoom call, when I think of myself 10 years ago, I would never have said that, because I'm like, oh, they're gonna like not like me, or I'm gonna mess up all these opportunities to do, they're gonna write me off as being angry or something negative. But I feel like each day my students remind me that they are learning something new. They're being provided with more spaces to talk about their issues and things like that. And also the complexities within the minority communities as well, because it's also issues like that. And I think just on a personal level, I've had conversations with some of my white peers that I never would have had certain things not happen. And I hate that it had to get as far as it did for it to happen, but I do think there are conversations that are happening now that it's small, but if many people are having these small conversations, it'll create a bigger change. And I'll just say, within my own classroom, I feel like I'm seeing my students feel more confident speaking up and discussing their views of race, and not just the bad stuff, but the good stuff too. And I think there's some emphasis that when we talk about Black lives, it's like, oh, it's so hard. And yes, it's hard, but there's so many great things as well. And I think we've seen Black culture now hit a mainstream level that I hope people can now see there's more than just the struggle. There's the culture, the richness of it. And I think the more they'll see it and understand us as people, it expands into the system. And I think I've seen that. And there are so many times as a kid, I wish I saw more people that look like me. And I'm seeing more of that now, and I feel happy about that. And I just hope that people remember that it's not just what you post on Facebook and Instagram for social capital, that it's like, what are you doing when there's no body to applaud you and give you a thumbs up because you did the right thing. Like, what are you doing in those spaces? And I hope that people are thinking about that, because that's where a lot of change can happen. And yeah, I do think there's some positive change, but there still needs to be more.
Yeah, I think we're getting to the point finally where someone pictures a marine scientist, and there are lots of people that are not the typical what people think. So I've had some people, some teachers and things like that reach out to me and say like, oh, my kid in my class wants to do a book report on, or wants to do a report on you. Can you talk to them? I'm like, how does this kid even know who I am? And so the fact that there are kids that have people to look up to that they identify with is great. Whenever I met my first Black woman marine scientist, or Black marine scientist, period, I think I was 22 or 23. And when I met her, we were talking, and she said, "Oh, I mentioned that she was the first Black marine scientist I ever met." And she said, "Well, I was 42 before I met my first Black marine scientist." So we cut it in half. And now I like do Skype with scientists, and I meet with kids that are 8, 9, 6, 7, and the fact that they are not going to have to wait until they're 20 to meet someone that looks like them doing something that they want to do is really makes me really hopeful for the future.
Okay, well, we just want to say thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for taking time out of your day and sharing your thoughts and opinions with us. We really appreciate it, and just want to say thank you to all of you for coming out. As you know, this event, we kind of wanted to make a little bit of a networking way so that no person of color feels alone in this industry or like in this market. So if any of the panelists feel comfortable to drop either their social media or a good email address they want to be like contacted at, if anybody here has any questions, if you're okay with them contacting you or just reaching out to you, we would really appreciate that from the panelists.